Mark Daniels lived a life that many envied. His house was well kept, with a white picket fence framing a small garden where his children played in the late afternoons. Neighbors waved when they passed, and his reputation in the community was spotless. Mark was known as a devoted husband and father, a man who showed up for every school play, birthday party, and neighborhood event. On the surface, everything about his life seemed ordinary, even idyllic. But beneath the calm exterior, there was a tension no one could see, a tension that had been quietly building for months. Mark had a secret. He was involved in a relationship with Jade Rivers, a 32-year-old transgender woman. Their meetings were brief and hidden, often in hotel rooms or secluded locations where no one could recognize them. To Mark, Jade was exciting and unpredictable, a stark contrast to his orderly family life. To Jade, Mark was someone she cared for deeply, someone she believed could one day leave his family and be with her openly. But Mark's life was a constant balancing act, a tightrope walk between the world he wanted and the world he was forced to maintain. Over time, Jade's visits became more frequent, her messages more insistent. Mark would read her texts late at night, anxiety gnawing at him as he stared at the words demanding his attention. Sometimes, he considered cutting ties entirely, but guilt and fear of confrontation held him back. He tried to compartmentalize, keeping his family life and his secret life strictly separate, but the walls between them were weakening. Neighbors later described noticing changes in Mark. He began pacing outside at odd hours, phone pressed tightly against his ear, his expression tense and wary. Once outgoing and sociable, he grew distant, avoiding conversations that might reveal too much. His wife, Linda, noticed his stress but assumed it was work-related, never imagining the real source. Even the children, attuned to their father's moods, felt a growing unease in the house, though they couldn't explain it. Mark's mind was a storm of fear, desire, and frustration. He imagined confrontations, worrying about what Jade might do if she discovered he wasn't leaving his family. He imagined her arriving unannounced, forcing him into impossible decisions. Each scenario intensified his anxiety, and the tension became almost unbearable. Sleep offered no relief, his dreams were filled with the fear of exposure and the chaos that would follow. Despite all this, Mark continued his routines. He took his kids to school, smiled at neighbors, and played the role of the perfect husband. He avoided conversations about the future with Jade, knowing that any promises he made could never be fulfilled. But the secret weighed on him like a shadow, always present, waiting for the moment it might break free. That moment came quietly at first, with the faintest signs, a missed call, a message left unread, a feeling that everything could collapse in an instant. Mark's life, so carefully constructed, was on the edge of unraveling, and neither he nor anyone around him could foresee just how quickly the tension would explode. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that usually carried the quiet hum of family life. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the living room where Mark Daniels sat with his wife, Linda, and their 2 children. The sounds of laughter and playful chatter filled the house as the children built towers with blocks on the carpet. Outside, birds chirped and a gentle breeze rustled the trees. Everything appeared normal, even peaceful, but beneath the surface, the tension that had been simmering for months was about to erupt. Without warning, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway cut through the calm. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he noticed a familiar car pulling up. It was Jade Rivers. She had arrived unannounced. Mark froze, his body suddenly rigid, a sense of dread washing over him. Linda, unaware of Mark's secret, looked up from the dishes she was drying, puzzled by the sudden appearance of a visitor. The children stopped playing, sensing that something had shifted, their innocent curiosity replaced by confusion. Jade's arrival was bold and unrelenting. She stepped out of the car as if she had every right to be there, her eyes fixed on Mark. Every step she took toward the front door amplified the tension in the house, and Mark felt panic creeping through him. He had never wanted this confrontation, never wanted his hidden life to collide so violently with the one he had built for his family. Now, the collision was inevitable. Mark's mind raced. He considered his options, each more desperate than the last. He could ignore her, send her away, call the police, or try to calm the situation, but fear had clouded his judgment. In a split second, he moved toward the drawer where he kept a firearm, the weight of it both literal and symbolic. The chaos of his double life had reached a tipping point, and he felt trapped, cornered by the consequences he had long avoided. Inside the house, Linda noticed the sudden change in Mark's demeanor. His normally calm face had hardened, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the drawer. The children, sensing the shift in their father, began to cry, their laughter replaced by unease. Outside, Jade continued to advance, unaware of the danger that had silently built up within Mark. What had started as a seemingly ordinary Sunday was transforming into a moment of irreversible tragedy. In that instant, the unthinkable happened. Mark fired the weapon. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood, shattering the illusion of peace. Jade collapsed on the front porch, the life draining from her in an instant. The children screamed, Linda froze in disbelief, and neighbors later recounted hearing a single, sharp report that would haunt them for months. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Mark's carefully constructed world unraveled in seconds. Police sirens wailed in the distance as paramedics rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Jade was gone, and the consequences of Mark's actions would ripple far beyond the walls of his home. What had begun as an unexpected visit had turned into a nightmare, leaving behind a scene of horror, shock, and irreversible loss. Mark's life, once orderly and admired, would never be the same again. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was transformed. Police cars with flashing lights arrived, their sirens cutting through the tension that still hung in the air. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their faces pale with disbelief. The Daniels home, once a symbol of ordinary domestic life, had become a scene of chaos. Inside, the reality of what had happened was impossible to ignore. Jade Rivers lay lifeless on the front porch, and Mark Daniels sat frozen, his face pale and uncomprehending. His wife, Linda, clutched their children, both sobbing and trembling, unable to process the sudden horror that had invaded their home. Detectives quickly took control of the scene. Mark was handcuffed without resistance, his shock and fear evident in every movement. Officers moved methodically, documenting every detail, noting the trajectory of the gun, the position of the bodies, and the items strewn across the living room. The investigators immediately sensed that this case was far more complicated than a simple act of violence. Questions raced through their minds. Why had Jade come to the house? What had driven Mark to such an extreme? What secrets lay hidden behind the walls of this ordinary suburban home? As the detectives sifted through the evidence, they uncovered a series of messages and phone calls between Mark and Jade. The exchanges revealed tension, desperation, and fear. Jade had been insistent, demanding to see Mark, while he had repeatedly tried to distance himself. Some messages hinted at confrontation, others at attempts to reconcile. Investigators began to piece together the pressure building over months, a pressure that had finally erupted in tragedy. The community was stunned. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling, capturing the stunned expressions of neighbors who could not reconcile the man they knew with the violence he had committed. Speculation ran rampant, fueled by fragments of information leaked in the chaos. Some wondered if this was a crime of passion, others suggested it had been planned. The town, normally quiet and secure, now found itself under a cloud of fear and disbelief. Psychologists called to consult on the case later suggested that the situation was a textbook example of escalating tension combined with poor coping mechanisms. Mark, they argued, had been under extreme psychological pressure, trapped between conflicting desires and responsibilities. His inability to manage fear and anger had culminated in an irreversible decision, one that ended a life and shattered a family. Meanwhile, Jade's family and friends struggled with grief and shock. They had no warning of her visit and no way to foresee the danger she would face. The tragedy raised difficult questions about personal boundaries, the consequences of secrecy, and the risks inherent in hidden relationships. As the investigation continued, the detectives realized that the case would require careful examination of motives, mental state, and the series of events leading up to the shooting. The investigation also revealed another layer of complexity: financial discrepancies in Mark's life and the possibility that Jade may have discovered information that could have exposed him. Every detail added weight to the narrative of fear, desperation, and betrayal. By the end of the day, it was clear that this was not simply an impulsive act. It was a collision of hidden truths, psychological strain, and unchecked emotions. The quiet suburban life that Mark had carefully constructed was gone forever, replaced by a tragedy that would haunt the town for years to come. As the investigation unfolded, more hidden layers of Mark Daniels' life came to light, painting a picture far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Detectives discovered that Mark had a long history of volatile behavior, particularly when he felt threatened or cornered. Friends described him as charming and responsible, but close acquaintances admitted that under stress, he could be unpredictable and controlling. The quiet, orderly life he displayed to the world was only a facade. Behind closed doors, tension and secrecy had been building for years, and the shooting was the tragic eruption of a storm no one had seen coming. The messages between Mark and Jade became a crucial part of the investigation. Some suggested that Jade had been trying to reconcile, hoping that Mark might leave his family and start a life with her openly. Others revealed moments of frustration and confrontation, as Jade increasingly pressed for honesty and clarity. Police began to piece together a timeline that showed repeated visits to Mark's home, sometimes unannounced, sometimes in response to his attempts to cut her off. Each encounter, each message, had escalated the tension between them, creating an environment where panic and fear were always simmering just beneath the surface. A surprising twist emerged when investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Jade may have discovered financial misconduct on Mark's part. Bank statements and hidden transactions hinted that he had been mismanaging funds, possibly to support a lifestyle he wanted to keep secret. Police theorized that Jade might have been planning to confront him about these matters, potentially exposing him. The combination of fear of exposure and fear of losing control over his double life seemed to have pushed Mark over the edge. What had started as a relationship kept in the shadows had evolved into a dangerous tangle of secrets, lies, and potential betrayal. Psychologists brought in to evaluate the case noted that Mark's mindset was one of extreme pressure and cognitive dissonance. He had been juggling a family, a secret lover, and personal ambitions, all while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. The arrival of Jade at his doorstep that fateful day represented not just a personal confrontation, but the collapse of the carefully constructed boundaries he had maintained for so long. His panic was immediate and absolute, and in that instant, the possibility of reasoned decision-making evaporated. Meanwhile, the community continued to reel from the shock. Neighbors who had once admired Mark now spoke in hushed tones, questioning how well anyone could truly know another person. Linda, struggling with grief and disbelief, began the slow process of piecing together the reality of her husband's hidden life. Friends and family of Jade mourned deeply, not only for her untimely death but also for the warning signs that had been missed. The tragedy raised uncomfortable questions about secrecy, loyalty, and the pressures that can build quietly behind closed doors. By the end of the investigation phase, it was clear that this was more than a crime of passion. The shooting had been fueled by a toxic mixture of fear, secrecy, and desperation, intensified by the possibility of exposure and betrayal. The story of Mark and Jade became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how hidden lives and unaddressed tension can collide with devastating consequences. Every new revelation only added to the complexity, showing that what seemed like a sudden, unthinkable act was, in reality, the result of months, perhaps years, of emotional and psychological pressure that had quietly escalated to tragedy. The trial of Mark Daniels drew national attention. Reporters lined the streets outside the courthouse, cameras capturing every movement, every expression. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and heavy, filled with people whose lives had been touched by tragedy in different ways. Mark appeared calm on the surface, but those who observed him closely could see the cracks, his eyes flickering with unease, his hands occasionally trembling. The courtroom was a place where the hidden truths of his life were about to be laid bare for everyone to see. Evidence presented by the prosecution was compelling. Messages between Mark and Jade were read aloud, revealing the escalating tension, the unannounced visits, and the fear that had been building over months. Experts testified about the psychological pressure Mark had been under, explaining how living a double life, combined with fear of exposure and betrayal, could push a person to extreme actions. The financial misconduct and potential for discovery added another layer of motive, showing that the shooting was not an isolated act of impulse, but the culmination of mounting stress and desperation. Testimonies from neighbors and friends painted a stark contrast between the public persona and the private reality. Outside, Mark had been admired as a devoted husband and father. Inside, he had been a man struggling to keep his life in balance, hiding secrets that would eventually erupt in tragedy. Linda's testimony was heartbreaking. She spoke of her shock and grief, the impossibility of reconciling the man she had known with the one who had taken Jade's life. Her words were quiet, measured, but heavy with pain. Jade's family also had their moment in court. They shared stories of her courage, her humor, and the challenges she had faced simply for being herself. They described her as vibrant and determined, a woman who had fought for authenticity in a world that often rejected it. Their grief was palpable, a reminder of the human life behind the headlines. The courtroom held its collective breath as each story added weight to the case, making the tragedy feel deeply personal rather than just a news report. When the verdict finally came, it was conviction. Mark Daniels was found guilty of murder. The judge described the act as a result of fear and desperation, yet emphasized personal responsibility for the irreversible consequences. Mark's carefully constructed life was shattered completely, leaving behind a fractured family and a community struggling to understand the events that had unfolded. In the days and weeks that followed, the town grappled with the aftermath. Discussions about secrecy, personal boundaries, and the pressures of hidden lives became central to conversations among neighbors. Linda faced the immense challenge of rebuilding her life and protecting her children from the trauma they had witnessed. Jade's memory was honored through friends and family who vowed to share her story, to remember her strength, and to fight for the acceptance she had always sought. The tragedy left a lasting mark, a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary lives can hide dangerous tensions. It served as a cautionary tale about fear, secrecy, and the devastating consequences of unresolved conflict. In the end, the story of Mark and Jade was one of irreversible loss, of lives forever altered, and of a community forced to confront the fragility of trust, love, and safety behind closed doors.